For any of us, transitions are difficult. Bringing together the huge transitions of a person dying, especially if it's a parent, and the starting of a new school year gives you a recipe for struggle and anxiety. I'm Dr. Galen Gobin, and I welcome you to this installment of Understanding Grief. If you have any questions or comments during this seminar, put them in the chat box and we will respond to them. We're joined here by Dr. David Schoenfeld, the director of the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. And he's here to provide some helpful context for this intersection of a significant change in a child's life. He will also offer ways to buttress or to support or reinforce that child as they are walking this difficult path. David, I'm glad to welcome you to this community at Journeys Through Grief. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Help us get into the mind of a grieving child. What might be a common concern of a student as they go back to school, especially one whose parent has died, maybe over the summer or late last semester?
Yeah. Well, returning to school always comes with some ambivalence. There's excitement, but there's about new opportunities, reuniting with your friends, meeting new teachers. But there's also a little bit of anxiety about what is it. Are there going to be challenges there? What's it going to be like? Well, when a parent has died or other caregiver, that increases those challenges. So some kids, it might be the first time they've seen their friends since they had a caregiver die, and they may be worried, what are they going to ask me? How do I handle the questions? Am I going to be able to hold it together for class? Am I going to be able to learn? Because it affects concentration. It affects a lot, their mood as well. So they often feel very isolated. So it may be a time that's filled with anxiety, and quite honestly, often those caregivers, the ones that children rely on to help them with transitions, one of them isn't there. And so it may also be even more complicated. And then, of course, when one caregiver dies, the remaining caregiver or caregivers often are grieving as well. Sure. And so the child may also be anxious about even leaving an adult behind. Will they be able to be okay if I'm not there to help them? Will they be all alone? Are they going to be even more sad? So there are a lot of different thoughts and worries that may be going through the mind of a child as they approach the first day of school.
Yeah, that's just, there's so much there that can just be almost overwhelming for them. And then again, throwing all the new stuff in that they're going to have to learn, new people and all of that stuff. Boy, it just really ramps that anxiety straight up.
Right.
So yeah, the new school year will, anything new is difficult for us as persons, but particularly as a young person, and all. What kinds of behaviors and changes might a parent sort of be on the lookout for to clue them in that a student's grief is really impacting their school experience?
Yeah, well, I think one thing you have to realize is that children will often try and protect the adults they care about when their adults are upset.
Sure.
So you may find that you won't see anything, and that doesn't mean the child's doing a great job. So a lot of times kids will hide their distress because they see a surviving parent or caregiver is struggling. I remember talking to one teenager, and what had happened was his sibling had died in an accident. His mother was a nurse at the hospital where I was working, and she took off for a couple months, about 2 months, after one of her children died. And then she was back at work for about a month and a half, and she came to see me and she said, I'm worried about my other child. He was doing fine for 2 months. And then all of a sudden now he can't concentrate at school. He seems depressed. He's having sleep problems. I don't understand why it's happening now. So she brings him in and he confirms the same thing. I was doing fine for 2 months. And then all of a sudden it just was too much for me. So I asked him, well, why do you think that happened? He said, I actually have no idea. I looked at him and I said, sometimes it's hard to see a parent grieve. And he looked at me and he said, if I had one more night where she cried herself to sleep on my shoulder, I was just going to lose it. And so he was postponing his grief he couldn't even start to grieve because he had to take care of his mom. And
Sure.
the dad, who was very supportive, was also in the house. So it wasn't that it was a single parent or a parent
Mhm.
who was not competent. She was just grieving as a parent would do
Sure.
after the
Sure.
tragic and sudden death of a child. And he was such an empathic kid that he
Mhm.
was literally and figuratively supporting her. And so I think the thing is, children may go back to school and you may not see any problem because they may not want to share that with the adults at home, which is one of the reasons why we have the Coalition to Support Grieving Students.
Okay.
We want educators and broadly all of the staff in a school to be able to support a child who's grieving, because sometimes families play an enormous role in supporting their children
Sure.
when they're grieving. But there's a unique role that people outside the family can play that may actually be an important role,
Mhm.
particularly if the caregivers are grieving themselves. So in terms of what you can see, though, or at least what may be present, was that children might obviously be sad or depressed. It might affect their social interactions. They may feel isolated or uncomfortable or awkward among other children. Usually at the beginning of the school year in particular, kids are trying to make friends. And
Mhm.
so they want to be positive. They want to have a good sense of humor. They don't want to be crying. They don't want to be sad. And they don't want to be
Yeah.
talking about deaths of family members. So what happens is they often become even more isolated because they don't feel that they can even share what's going on with friends. And if they can't share it with family either, that doesn't leave them a lot of outlets. They may also have trouble concentrating. You'll get thoughts about the person that died and how you miss
Sure.
them. We call them grief triggers in the
Yeah.
field. So there may be something that a teacher says or does that reminds them of the individual that
Mhm.
died. It can be anything simple like, when you get home, remind your parents to sign this. And if one of your parents died, that might reactivate some of the grief that a child has. Or it
Sure.
could be that they start, there's a perfume that a teacher wears. It was just like what mom wore,
Yeah.
or the teacher's voice reminds them of their dad or their grandparent. So a lot of times kids will be caught off guard and then feel emotionally upset in a classroom setting, being observed by people. And so we tell schools, let kids know that they can have these periods where they temporarily feel more emotional distress and figure out a safety plan. Where can they go? Who can they go talk to? How can they absent them? How can they step out of the classroom until they're ready to return? And where can they go if they're going to do that?
Yeah. One of the things I find interesting and really want to point out for in particular parents listening is that the stuff that you've listed here are normal grief reactions. They're just in your kid. It's trouble concentrating and potentially trouble sleeping, and the anxiety about is this a safe place wherever I find myself, that if something happens, am I going to be overwhelmed? And I've encouraged folks to just sort of make sure that they're aware of those things in themselves, and then ask their children about them. Are they having those kinds of experiences and stuff? So just being aware of what some of the normal stuff is, that your child doesn't have to be such a you don't have to worry so much about the child being kind of a stranger to you in the midst of that.
Yeah, I think it's important that the adults in the family share some of their distress.
Right.
More importantly, what do they do to cope with that distress? Because people will say, well, I have to be strong. But if you're being strong and you're not crying and you're not telling them that you're having any problems with anything else, then they're going to think that these reactions that I have are not normal. And
Right.
furthermore, I don't know what to do about it. And
Right.
so if a parent says, I really miss your dad. Last night I was thinking about him and it really made me sad. But then I wrote down some of my positive memories of him and it made me feel better. So you're modeling certain coping
Right.
strategies. But I always tell people, you can't model coping if you pretend you never had distress in the first place.
Right.
It is
Oh,
not actually helpful to hide your distress. It is helpful to share the distress in the service of teaching the coping skills to the child. Now, I have seen occasionally where parents become so overwhelmed,
yeah.
and they're not. It's not that they're just not coping well. I mean, remember one mother, she had a child that died. And in front of her other child, she talked about the fact that she didn't want to live and she was going to kill herself, and grabbed a knife, and
Boy.
family members had to pull the knife from her in front of the
Mhm.
child. That is not useful for
No.
anyone to
No.
see, for that matter. So I'm not suggesting that you want parents to share their deepest distress.
Right.
And so they need to get help for themselves,
Right.
from outside the family or from extended family, faith-based organizations, healthcare providers, mental health providers, bereavement support groups, if they are struggling themselves, but they can share some of that distress. But again, the emphasis is on, this is what I did that
Right.
made it better, didn't make it go away, but just made it better. You might wish to try some of that yourself.
Yeah, yeah. That modeling is so important, and it just makes such a difference for those kids later on in life too. Talk a little bit, if you would, about much of what I think maybe we're thinking, or people might be experiencing, is about younger kids, but this is true throughout early ages and adolescence, isn't it, as well, that we need to support our kids, if you will, even if they're moving into college or into the military or a new job after college or something. Is that
I actually think those transitions out of the home are particularly complicated when there's a family member that's died, because number one, kids may feel it's selfish and inappropriate for them to leave behind their grieving family when they aren't able to help with siblings or aren't able to help surviving parents. And they then have to go to a very new environment. So college is kind of a transition that we talked about, but on steroids. So there you're really starting over. So it's generally, you don't know anyone there. You're placed in a very different type of environment. People are really trying to make friends, but they're doing it by parties and celebrations and things like that. And that may feel very uncomfortable and foreign to a child who's grieving. And the other thing is that they are separated from all the supports they may have relied upon in the past. The church that they went to go, or the temple, or that they used to go to, where they got some solace, the quiet space in the backyard or at the park where they can collect their thoughts, their own bedroom. So they don't have privacy generally. They're not even alone when they're sleeping or even in the bathroom. So they are constantly surrounded by people and may feel really awkward in that situation. And both of my kids, when they went to college, told me that whatever food they served was the opposite of comfort food. They didn't know really how to describe it, but they knew it did not make them comfortable. And they would come home and eat, comfort food that they were used to. So if you imagine that you put all those stressors on a child, you then give them challenging academic work in a different environment where they have to rely on themselves to monitor their learning. They don't have the supports in place. They're uncomfortable with the setting, and they're grieving and worried about those that they left behind. So it's a really very stressful time for them. And so not only should families stay in touch, obviously, but you also should be trying to identify what resources are there. Is there a bereavement support group for young adults at the college? There are programs such as that in many colleges. Do they know how to get to someone in the counseling center? Is there someone on campus who has a support position, whether it's at the counseling center or the RA in the dorm, that knows that this child is grieving and can check in with them and give them a little bit more attention and support? So you just want to make sure that you help them with that transition, because it's a really tough transition for young adults to make.
Yeah, it's hard enough, hard enough as it is in general, and then you throw that whole sense of the world being unsafe and what can I do around here? And I think one of the things for supporting kids is to let the teachers and administrators know. Would you encourage parents, for a child who maybe has joined the military or has moved off to school, to reach out to those administrators as well, or is that
but I
something
think
the parents should just encourage the student to do?
I think it has to be done with permission by the
Yeah, okay.
child and in a manner that feels comfortable to the child.
Uh-huh.
I haven't had a lot of experience in young adults transitioning into the military, but I would just imagine that that's got to be really challenging.
Yeah.
And that teenager that I was talking about who was supporting his mother, who was the nurse, he was planning on going into the military, but he still had another year or two before he was
Okay.
going to make that transition. But we could just imagine going into the military knowing that you may be in combat and that you're preparing for that.
Yeah.
That's just complicated. It's so many levels, and there's so much that's not under your control.
Yeah.
When you're in that kind of setting. Now, but yes, I would encourage the student to tell someone in that environment.
Okay.
Now, it might be someone, as I said, mental health, it might be an RA, it may be an educator, but again, they don't know any of the educators yet in most situations. Or it may be that there's a local relative, or that there's a friend of the family who can kind of be a proxy relative. I mean, I know when my kid crossed the country to go to college, my oldest child, so for the first time, there was someone who I worked with, but they lived across the country from where we were living and in the same town as the school. And they just said, I will be her aunt. Like and there wasn't any crisis in the family. It was like,
Right.
I can pick her up at the airport from time to time. I can take her out to dinner. We'll meet for coffee. I'll see how she's doing. And they grew close. And I have done that for other people when they say, my kid's going to be in Los Angeles and I'm in LA and they're on the East Coast. I go, I'm here. And I meet the kid and I say, hey, I have a house. If you ever feel like you need to get away, please come over here. I know dentists, I know pediatricians, I know, I know good restaurants.
Right.
I'm here for you. And that brings comfort to the parents. And it brings comfort, I think, to the students as well. But again, they aren't necessarily grieving or in distress. But if they are, I think it becomes even more important. I did have one kid who came to school in Los Angeles, and his mother was and father were across the country. And there had been a mass shooting at their home. And a lot of his friends died right in the summer, right before he came here. And they were getting worried about him. And so I was like, I'm going to check in on you. I'm not here to check in for your mom or dad.
Right.
But, if studying gets hard, if you need some time away, I'll pick you up. I'll come and visit you and stuff. And I don't think that the murder hadn't happened like a week or two beforehand, and he actually was doing well. But there was a time period where I couldn't reach him, and I called a couple times and I said, look, if you're out having fun, just let me know. And he did call and he said, I am so sorry. I was out studying and then I went out with a friend, and he goes, I'm okay. But it really helps me to know you're checking on me and that you're there. So I never had to actually get together with him, but he did know I was there for him. So I think some young adults might say, I don't really want to be treated special. I don't want to go for counseling. I'm okay. But I think you got to find someone local who's there in case.
Right.
And we'll be there, at least let them know I care and I'm here.
Yeah. Yeah. I just to point out the things that I'm hearing you say, Dave, and the kind of language that I would use are like basically building some boundaries within the space in the child's life that create a sense of safety. Knowing, so that the classroom is safe, so that the teachers know it's safe at home, where the child knows that they can talk to mom or dad or display their experiences and their feelings and stuff. So creating the boundaries in which they can feel safe. And then so many practical things, just so much of grieving really is about finding the practical stuff with it too, and creating a space or creating those practical things and being those practical elements that can take an awful lot of stress off of a grieving person. Those are two things that come to mind as I'm hearing you talk, that just really make some sense.
And it may be that, if it is a parent or caregiver that died, they may need some help with the things that individual did for them.
Right.
Because they lose the person, that's the primary loss, but they also lose everything the person did for them or might do for
Right.
them in the future, and that's all those secondary losses. And
Yeah.
so that might have been the person they went to whenever they had a medical question, might have been the person that helped them figure out how to study. It might have been the person that helped them navigate some tricky social interactions.
Mhm.
Or it might have been someone that they called up and said, you know, I'm having trouble making friends. What should I do? And that person might have been the one that helped them with that. And
Yeah.
so finding someone else that can do that, whether that's, you know, extended relatives, family, friends, other people locally, doesn't have to be one person to do all of that.
Right.
I'm not talking about replacing the parent,
Mm-mm.
but it may be that if this is the person I went to for career counseling, it'd be good to talk to one of the counselors at the school who do academic counseling, because I'm going to need a little more help with that. So
Yeah.
just kind of understanding what it is that you're missing and where can you find that in other people. But it doesn't necessarily mean they have to go for therapy or counseling,
Yeah.
because bereavement is a normative experience, but it's still a really hard one.
Yeah.
I think that that's what happens is people start saying, well, everyone who's grieving goes through this. That may be true. It's still very hard. And so you
Still
should
hard.
still have someone help you with it. I
That's
think we
right.
spend way too much with this. Is it normal or abnormal? And do you need counseling? And I always tell people, why don't you just decide whether it might be helpful? And if it would be helpful and it's bothering, something's bothering you, why don't you accept that help? You don't have to, and so that's the way we should look at it. And so I don't usually talk about getting bereavement counseling as much as
Right.
bereavement support.
Yeah. Just the
So
support.
you want to normalize, that's what you should do, because it's really hard.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Is there anything, where we want to, many of us just want to forget about the pandemic and are moving beyond and all that kind of stuff. But is there any residual stress that's left with that? Then how might that play into the experience of kids at school?
Well, sure. Well, so first off, one of the many challenges with the pandemic was that it lasted so long. So
Yeah.
people, it's not a single isolated event. It
Mm-mm.
just kept going.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, the pandemic has not fully ended for people. There are still people getting sick. COVID is, I mean, we're starting to get a little uptick now, and that brings some more anxiety about it. But I think for the most part, the public health emergency part is over, which is great. And people hopefully have been vaccinated or can be vaccinated. So that we're in a much different space now, but there was a long period that lasted.
Yeah.
We also have to realize that over 1 million people died in this country. So many people have had losses, and those losses are lifelong. And
Yep.
so if somebody very close to you has died, you're still grieving for that.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the grieving and mourning that you would have normally done, you weren't able to do during the pandemic because of restrictions on, not only restrictions on being in the same room, but also restrictions on travel. I had a family member who died, and they were on the other coast, and I went a year afterwards for the unveiling of the tombstone, because that family is Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember when we were there, and the death had occurred early on in the pandemic. When we were there, they commented that they had family, close family from Australia who still weren't able to travel.
Mm-hmm.
So not only did they miss the funeral, but they missed the unveiling a year later. I don't think people realize that there's this level
Right.
of restriction of mourning practices and of emotional support. And then even when people were able to travel, elderly people in particular, or those who had serious health problems, may still not have done it. Now, I know a lot of people went back with, traveling as much as they could, but there were a number of people who might have had more either emotional concern about traveling or had physical reasons or health problems that made it less likely that they could travel. And as a result, you should expect that this is going to be more prolonged in terms of the adjustment. But if you've lost over 1 million people, that still has impact.
Yeah.
And not only that, is that there are all these other crises and stressors that occurred as a result of the pandemic. So the pandemic changed people's livelihood, it changed their finances, it changed the structure of communities. People are still there are parts of our society right now that are still struggling financially because of the pandemic. So it may be that, so let's say you work in a restaurant that's in a downtown area that might be gone bankrupt recently because there wasn't the anticipated return to the office. Each crisis tends to set off, a cascade of other crises and losses. And so you may find individuals and families being affected in a way that you didn't anticipate, because, I mean, the pandemic, when it was occurring, that's pretty clear. I mean, people were getting sick and people were
Right.
dying, and you would anticipate that. But people would say, well, the unemployment rate is low now. The economy is coming back. But if you're one of those people who isn't in that group,
Yeah.
even though that might be the majority, then you start to feel like, well, I should be feeling okay, and I'm not. And so it can be even more difficult, I think, for some people during the recovery phase, if
Yeah.
they don't feel that they are really on the same road to recovery. And now people are, I just got a notice a couple hours ago, with my electric bill, the penalties and removal of electricity will now occur,
Yep.
so all the people who had protections put into place, some of them are now becoming homeless, some of them are now losing basic services. Families that need are coming off of Medicaid because they no longer automatically enroll them or presume eligibility. So there's a tail to these crisis events.
Right.
We're still in it.
Yeah. And it's gonna play out by adding still more continued stressors in the lives of families, which then play into the lives of their children as they're working with that. So yeah. David, tell us a little bit about the what people might find there at the website for the coalition and stuff. What kinds of things do you all have that can help parents to be, again, more prepared and understand more, and is it only just for parents?
No, so the coalition to support grieving students was actually initially established through school-based professional organizations. So the New York Life Foundation, that provides a lot of support to our center, and our center, the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, which is at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, we convened 10 different professional organizations. So the AFT and the NEA, two major teachers unions, 4 school superintendent and principal organizations, and the major organizations for school counselors, school nurses, school social workers, and school psychologists.
Wow.
So those organizations together represent 5 million school professionals, and they came together to develop the material for the coalition. And actually, we continue to meet. We just had a meeting in person in Washington a couple months ago, and in November we have a meeting on November 1st to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the coalition in New York City. But since we launched the website in 2015, over 100 other professional organizations have joined. So we're now up to over 135 organizations, and they include things like the American Academy of Pediatrics, Boys and Girls Club, the National PTA, Save the Children. It's a long list. So anyway, the materials that we developed and that have been endorsed by all these groups represent over 20 video-based modules that go over a wide range of topics.
Great.
Like how most of them are 10 to 15 minutes long, and they have print summaries. All of this is free. It is accessible by the public. You don't need to register or anything. You can just go look at it. So you just go to grievingstudents.org, and you'll find that you can watch a video on funeral attendance. You can watch a video on academic challenges, guilt. So there's a wide range. It's over 20. And what you'll find is that we've interviewed children as well as school professionals and parents, and then put that together with kind of a little presentation with some slides. It's me talking about some of the key points to consider, and it's interspersed with the interview content. So that is one part of what's there. We have also additional modules that are in print form for special circumstances, such as you mentioned the military, a line of duty death in the military, how do you support children impacted by that? There's one also for line of duty death for the police. And we worked with the organizations that provide support to those communities. And then we have a lot of written information. So there's a booklet, After a Loved One Dies. It's written for parents or caregivers, and that's available in English and Spanish in hard copy.
Right. Okay.
Anyone can order copies, and they're free of charge. And the shipping and handling is also free. It's paid for by New York Life as a public service. We also have, though, translated that booklet. Now it's in a total of 9 languages, and those can be downloaded in PDF format. So you'll find a lot of other materials, links. You can link up to a resource from Aluna that will tell you where the bereavement support groups and programs are in your community. So you can put in where you live, your zip code. It will tell you, it'll give you a directory of programs that you can reach out to, bereavement camps, hospice programs as well. So there's a lot on that grievingstudents.org. And then the National Center's website, National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, that's schoolcrisiscenter.org. And there we have a range of materials that deal more with school crisis events.
Okay.
But that's actually a good place to get the booklet I was referring to as well. So anyway, you can find resources at both of those websites. All of them are free of charge.
That's fabulous. We're going to put that PDF, After a Loved One Dies, the one you mentioned about in 9 different languages. We're going to have that one posted here, and we certainly will have the links for the 2 websites here too, just to make it easy for everybody. They're marvelous websites. I've been through and looked at a lot of different things, and Journeys Through Grief is one of the friends of the Grieving Students organization there. And we're really glad to be able to be a part of that in some small way, and so thankful to have you here with us, David. This has been really, really wonderful and rich, and just the whole experience. And I think it's going to be very, very helpful for many, many people.
Well, great. And again, thank you for inviting me, because I know your program does a lot to support grieving families. So if we can help you to continue to do the work that you do, or have even more resources for the families you serve, we're happy to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. We will be connecting again. And we want to thank everybody for being with us, either in real time or in the future, whenever you get an opportunity to watch this. It's, again, a lot of great information, and I think you'll find a lot of really good support at the other websites. My continued thanks to my colleague Jessica for monitoring the feed and for doing so much with the website that we have, and for our Facebook page. When you go there, follow us so that you can get notified of other wonderful videos like this and these interviews that we have, and great information. But we are mostly there just to be for you as grieving people. Whatever you may need, let us know, and we will respond to that. So we here at Journeys Through Grief are sending you peace as you grieve your loss, and take care.